lives in Alexandria, Virginia, and is a proud descendant of the Conwell family. Third great-grandson of Martin and Miranda Conwell through their daughter, Katty Conwell Ring, and the second great-grandnephew of Russell Conwell. Russell, of course, founded Temple University among his other many accomplishments. Rusty continues this legacy as a dedicated member of the Temple University Library Board of Visitors, playing an active role in sustaining the university's tradition and vision. Rusty professionally is a senior executive at Roche Diagnostics Corporation, where he leads the government affairs group. He and his wife, Laurie, who joined us for last year's Conwell Sunday, reside near George Washington's Mount Vernon estate. They are parents of 4 sons. Rusty's son Colin is with us today, lives in Somerville, the same city where Russell Conwell's son Leon once served as mayor. Today, Rusty is here to share the story of how the Conwell family arrived in South Worthington, including the moving tale of a tragic love story that drew them to this beautiful village. Rusty.
Julie, thank you so much for that introduction. I appreciate it. And Maddie, thank you for inviting me. Last year we talked about it, and at first I was like, I'm not sure I want to do this. But then I realized, I had kind of a very interesting story that I'd like to share with you. First of all, you're welcome for me bringing the Virginia weather with me. I apologize for that. This is what we're used to, but the difference is we get air conditioning in every building. But it's nice to be up here every time I come up here, and I've been coming up here since I was a little child. In fact, I have a picture of myself up with Eagle's Nest. I was probably 5 or 6 when it was still the Eagle's Nest before, and Mark made some great renovations, and actually I prefer what he did over what the Eagle's Nest looked like. But it was a picture in front of the rock up on the hill that has the plaque, and it just always struck me. And we always came to this church because my 3rd great-grandfather was one of the folks that founded it, but all of the other people on that plaque I'm related to as well. So it's very much this is where my family's from. So anyway, before I tell that tale about the Conwells, I wanted to give you a little backstory on why I'm so interested in the Conwell story. While I was born and raised in Alexandria, Virginia, and continued to live there, my Ring family, they came into Plymouth, and then they moved to Kingston, and then they moved in the mid-1700s out here. And most of my family that were here at the time, the Pomeroys, the Clarks, the Cowans, the Niles, the Coles, they were all here right when it started, except for one family, and that was the Conwells. I majored in history in college, and I've always had a great, deep interest in genealogy, and I got that from my dad. My dad was a big believer in family history and passing that on, and that's why we came up here so often. Being from Virginia, it was important to know about our Massachusetts roots. So I'm very happy that he did. I started many years ago, I can't remember, it was probably 20 years ago, I started to try to trace my Conwell roots. And what was interesting was I couldn't understand how Martin Conwell's father, who was Martin Conwell Sr., ended up in Worthington, Mass. Because he was born in Baltimore and he died in Baltimore. And I thought, that's impossible. In 1810, nobody did that. You wouldn't go all the way from Baltimore, Maryland, which doesn't seem so far today, but back then it was going to another continent, and then have a family and then come back. I just said, this can't be right. I must have messed up. I'll put it aside. And I did for a very long time. Then during COVID, after the first hectic couple of years, I decided, I'm going to go back and find out what's going on. So I found a biography that was written at the time. It was probably in the 1890s or probably in the early 1900s about this story about the Conwells. And that's really what I wanted to share with you today. It's a story of, it's this beautiful love story, but it's also tragic. And so I want you to be prepared. I'll say this, and once I go through this at the end, if you have any questions, I've spent a lot of time researching this and finding out what a wonderful region this is, what a wonderful town this really is. So I'd like to share that with you. When I looked back at the original Conwells and where they came from, and this was the issue really for me. It was William Conwell came to Virginia in the 1640s, and I thought, that's interesting. I wonder if I'm related to him, or if Martin Conwell is related to him. And so that family really was a Southern family, and the fact that Martin Conwell Sr. was born in Baltimore made complete sense to me, but I just didn't get how to make the leap to Worthington or South Worthington. Anyway, the answer came in a book, chapter 2 of Albert Hatcher Smith's 1899 biography of Russell H. Conwell. And the chapter's entitled An Early Romance. It was there that I finally learned the story, and I'd like to share that with you today. So in the year 1810, a young man went from Western Massachusetts to a college in Baltimore. In college, his most intimate friend was a student from Eastern Maryland by the name of Martin Conwell. When the New Englander returned home from his summer vacation, his Maryland friend Martin accompanied him as his guest, and while there, he was employed by the local school board to teach school during the fall and winter months. And by the way, I found out just this afternoon from my cousin Gloria Conwell down the street that where her red house is, just to the right of that is where that schoolhouse was. Before the school term ended, he fell in love with a Miss Hannah Niles, who was then engaged to be married to a young man by the name of Cole. The young lady was more attractive to the young schoolmaster than her intended. The next spring, the young couple ran away to Hatfield, a town a few miles distant, and were married. Returning after a 2 weeks honeymoon, the groom went to his boarding house and the bride to her father's home. The news of their marriage circulated through the neighborhood and created great indignation. That a young school teacher from Maryland should marry a girl who was engaged to one of their homeboys it was more than the neighbors could stand. Hannah's father held her a prisoner in her room. One day, he went to her room with a shotgun and compelled her to write a letter to her young husband, saying that he had taken an unfair advantage of her and declaring that she would have nothing more to do with him. Upon receipt of this letter, the poor schoolmaster was greatly perplexed, not knowing that his bride was being held prisoner. He, however, answered the letter, requesting one more meeting at the schoolhouse. However, the letter was opened and read by her father. Hannah knew nothing of it. Then the time arrived. The young schoolmaster went to the schoolhouse and proceeded to pack up his books, but was interrupted by his wife's father, who came with several neighbors and threatened to kill him. Martin fastened the heavy shutters and held the fort. By evening, an immense crowd had gathered, heavily armed. It was a disgraceful mob. The schoolmaster refused to come out and be killed, so they set fire to the schoolhouse and burned it over his head. When he could no longer remain inside the burning schoolhouse, Martin leaped through a window, made his escape across the neighboring swamp, and thus saved his life. Several shots were fired, some of which pierced his clothing, and as nothing could be found of his body, the blood had been seen upon the leaves of the bushes. He was reported to his young bride as dead. She never heard from him afterwards. A son was born to her, whom she named Martin Conwell after his father. Hannah married her former intended, surprisingly, and raised a family of children. After her second husband was dead and her children married, she went to live with her oldest son, Martin. She had always grieved for her first husband, never feeling quite certain whether he was alive or dead. As she grew old, Hannah cried a great part of the time. Russell H. Conwell remembers saying to his mother, "Mama, what makes Grandma cry so?" His mother answered, "Don't say anything about it, because you will only make it worse." But she is crying for her grandfather, for your grandfather, whom she married when a young woman, and who, she was told, was killed by a mob. Turning to the end of her life, she sat in the old armchair by the open fireplace and cried until her heart broke, wondering why her young husband had left her, why he had never come back, and if it was really true that he was dead. The matter was seldom spoken of in the Conwell home, and the family feeling that it was a kind of a disgrace. In the year 1897, after a morning service in the Philadelphia temple, a stranger shook hands with Russell Conwell, remarking, "You look wonderfully like a man I used to work for down in Maryland." "What was his name?" inquired the preacher. "Martin Conwell," was the reply. "I lived with him for 20 years. He kept a store, accumulated property, but never married. He told me that in his early life he was married to a young woman in Worthington, Massachusetts, but that she had repudiated him, and he had not heard from her afterwards. He, however, never cared for any other woman and died grieving for the bride of his youth. The lovers never met in this world. Each died grieving for the other. He thought she repudiated him. She thought he had forsaken her. Both were in doubt, but they died lovers." So to me, it's a haunting and tragic tale, and it came from a faithful love that brought the Conwells to Worthington and to Massachusetts. Martin Conwell was really a fascinating guy. That union between Martin and Hannah Niles produced that son, Martin Conwell, Jr., who carried this story forward. Martin Conwell was a man of great strength and conviction. My father was always very proud to have him in our family, and his story is almost, to me, in some ways more impactful than Russell Conwell's because of what he did for this area. He was, through his less than formal education, he was still a very wise man, and he had moral clarity. It's part of the reason why he founded this church. He became a poignant and important figure in the abolitionist movement, and in fact, he was the conductor of the Underground Railroad between Springfield and Vermont. So you can imagine a very dangerous job to have back in the 1840s and 50s. In fact, he was very close friends with John Brown. In fact, John Brown spent a lot of time at the Conwell house at the top of the hill. And to the point where my great-great-grandmother and Russell Conwell called him Uncle Brown. So farming in this terrain, as you can well imagine, is not that easy. In fact, in the 1800s, it was even harder. Russell Conwell once joked that the sheep had developed genetically to have sharp noses so that they could get the food between the rocks. So farming wasn't the best thing to do around here. Obviously, it became a manufacturing hub, and in fact, my ancestors owned a slave factory down the street, and the ruins of that factory are still there, and every time I come, I always visit it. But Martin Conwell recognized that farming wasn't good enough to survive alone. So he set up a general store, and in fact, my great-great-grandparents decided to take a foray out into the Midwest and went to Peoria, Illinois, discovered that it wasn't the panacea that they thought it would be, and so they moved back here. And Martin Conwell's source, they really saved my family because they had something to do here to make a living. My grandfather, Carlisle Conwell Ring, was born in Westfield, and he took immense pride in his great uncle Russell Conwell. Through my ancestors, though my ancestors were really never wealthy, we firmly believed in education. And it was the path to our future, and it was our acres of diamonds. So one of the things that was important in my family's life was that one time when my grandfather and my great uncle were visiting and they were just getting ready to go to college, Russell Conwell had a speech and raised money for them. He did the Acres of Diamonds speech, and he gave all the money that he raised from that speech to my great uncle and to my grandfather. And they were able to go to college. My grandfather ended up becoming a superintendent of schools and a college professor, and he also founded Jamestown Community College and was their first president. My great uncle became a physician down in Florida. So I think it's fair to say that through this, the Conwells had a very important part in not only this community and building it and trying to help it thrive, but also in the success of my family. So with that, I don't know if anybody has any questions, but this was the story of South Worthington.